Hi, I'm Liam Dann. Welcome to another season of Money Talks, a podcast about our relationship with money. We're not going to tell you how to get rich. We're not going to try and pick the next interest rate move. In this series, I'll be talking to some interesting New Zealanders about how money has shaped their lives and what they've learned about it through the years. With me today, I have a politician who, in a radical 4-year burst of reforms through the 1980s, probably shaped our economy more than anyone else alive. Former Finance Minister Sir Roger Douglas. G'day, Roger. One of the questions I always start with is memories of money. What's the thinking right back? What's the first memory you have of having money in your hands or
Well, that would be to go and buy some lollies at the local dairy. I can always remember my mother, however, had a certain number of jars or tins on the top cupboard. She probably kept them there for a good reason. And she used to allocate it, electricity, power, this bill or that bill. And so that's probably my first memory of money.
Yeah, I mean, from your point of view as a child, did it feel like there was money was tight in the house growing up? What sort of?
Well, not really. Although it was a state house. So it wasn't as if we were loaded, and the fact that Mum had those jars is an indication of that. But, I got fed. There was plenty of fruit trees around the place, so I could take what I liked, and so never felt in any way deprived.
Yeah, and it was always a political family. So you were saying your grandfather was an MP, your father was involved with the union movement, is that right?
Well, he was involved. He was a trade union secretary. He was also involved with John A. Lee's party, and I think he stood in Onehunga for the Democratic Labour Party. Or
so
whatever.
was that further out to the left?
Well, yeah, they were pretty radical in terms of monetary policy and things like that. So they'd have definitely been on the left there. That's one of my first memories of being involved in politics, is actually going during the school holidays to Tabernacle Buildings and helping to fold the John A. Lee Weekly, and
wow.
And it was sent off. And it's funny what you do remember as a child. We used to go down for lunch to a cafeteria on Cranny Happy Road there, and quite often Frank Langston, who was the Member of Parliament for Roskill, he'd turn up. So there'd be John A. Lee, and of course I'd be sitting there so long as I got my sausage roll. I'd probably reasonably happy.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, would you have had money in your pocket? Did you get pocket money?
No, it tended to be when I needed it. I got my money to go to the pictures on Saturday, or I used to try to get a little bit extra when I went over to practice for the Ellerslie Sea Eagles rugby league team. Always tried to get an extra sixpence or whatever it was, so I could get some fish and chips, but not always successful, but sometimes.
Yeah, and as you got older, did you have part-time jobs?
Not really. When I got to grammar, I mean, I was pretty busy. I played rugby there. I played cricket in the first 11 from the fifth form. So, there was plenty to do, and I probably just didn't have time.
Yeah, and you must have done all right academically. I mean, you kind of you went on to uni and did accountancy. Is that right?
Yeah, I was an average student. I was good at some things. I was very good, I think, at arithmetic at Ellerslie Primary, but I wasn't particularly good at any other subject.
Yeah. But I mean, something like doing accountancy or choosing to do that often, and actually I talked to John Key who did the similar sort of thing. Was it seen as a sort of a sensible career option to take that path?
It was certainly a career option. I did think of becoming a school teacher, and I looked at that because they had, all these bribes, if you like. They'd pay you to go to university, etc. But in the end, I didn't think that was me. So I looked at accountancy was the sort of way I'd go. So I either was going to go to a public accountant's office, could have gone to one of the banks, offered a job there. But again, I don't know. I just thought I'd throw myself in the deep end, as it were.
Yeah. So did you actually work as an accountant for long before politics called?
Well, I had 5 years at Maybe Halstead and Kittle. It's quite interesting because Eric Halstead, of course, was Minister of Trade and Industry in the National Party, and then I went from there to Bremworth Carpet and had 9 or 10 years there as their company secretary.
Talking to you about is coming from that labour union background is when ideas started to get into your head that maybe there was another way of looking at the world.
Well, quite early. You've got to remember my grandfather, who was Member of Parliament for 25 years, he also had his own business. He was a herbalist, and he had a shop in Simon Street, probably. Anyway, up at Simon Street, opposite the post office there. So I used to go in there occasionally, and he would go to Parliament for the week, and he'd come back and see his followers, if you like, customers on the weekends. And he made his own tablets and etc. So, I got a bit of experience from that.
In the business side of things. I mean, what's your memory of sort of New Zealand, the economy and the economic world in New Zealand around that time? I guess we're talking about the 50s and 60s.
Well, I think probably, funny, you talk politics and that. Probably my most vivid memory was a street, well, there's a number, but one of them that stuck with me was a street corner meeting that was held further up the road from where we lived. And it was the election where National was saying they were going to let people buy their own state houses, and Labor was violently against that. And I couldn't quite understand that even then. That probably taught me a lesson. I think it probably taught the Labor Party a lesson too.
Yeah, I mean, when you obviously you got drawn into politics, it was in the family, but I guess it was always, politics can be a bit tribal. It was always going to have to be the Labor Party.
Oh, absolutely, and you couldn't have been in my environment without it being the Labor Party. The other option was just, forget it, and I think, but of my 2 brothers, they were involved to some extent, and the only one who sort of walked away from politics was my sister Sue, and this was not for me.
Yeah. So you're working, you had a pathway for a career and being an accountant in the business world, but something about, was it local body politics to start with? And then...
Yeah, it was local body. I stood, I think it was 1965, stood for the Manukau City Council. Funnily enough, Jim Anderton stood at the same time, and there were 3 seats on the Manukau City from Mangere, and Jim and I won, and Clive Ella, I think it was his name, and it started from there.
So something went well. Obviously you must have been quite good at it. I mean, you said you didn't necessarily excel at one thing in particular at school, but once you got into that political environment, it sounds like you kind of thrived.
Yeah, well, I think I always knew what I stood for, and I was a fairly good organiser. I was Colin Moyle's campaign manager in 1963 when he won that seat, and I was represented that seat at the Auckland Regional Council of the Labor Party, and I became president of that, and I was about 19 64, so I was a fairly young man, and it went on from there. And really, the decision for me was, do I stay in business? UEB offered me the company secretaryship of the textile area, and I had to make a decision, but I decided that I'd go the political way.
Yeah, and I mean, well, I could say the rest is history, but it's pretty interesting history because really that period is still, is a very defining period for New Zealand. I think it still overhangs a lot of the thinking, a lot of the politics nowadays. I mean, it was revolutionary. I mean, I guess it comes out of the 1970s, and you were in the Labour Party through those Muldoon years, where New Zealand got itself into all sorts of trouble. How do you look at that now?
They did in the end. Well, I still think about that. I'm still doing a wee bit of writing at the moment. But, my first recollection, that really comes back to my accounting background, was I introduced a private members bill into Parliament in 1972 to establish superannuation for everyone. And there were two things behind that. One was the feeling that maybe in the long run the pension, old age pension, was going to be insufficient. But more importantly was the issue of fairness. If parliamentarians could have this superannuation, lump sum superannuation scheme, why couldn't my constituents? And so, we went from there. Muldoon, and the next year we won the election. Bill Rowling introduced the super bill. It was parked, and Muldoon saw an opportunity and wiped it. And really, if you think about politics since then, he wiped it in 1976. We've never settled it. I mean, there's been the attempt by Bolger and Mike Moore to come to some agreement on it, but it was never going to work because it wasn't an adequate change. And here we are in 2023, and it's going to be top of the mind for a lot of people at this election because the recent report of Treasury says if we don't change, we're going bankrupt.
Yeah, and leaping back, that superannuation scheme that was scrapped by Muldoon is the one that Brian Gaynor wrote a famous article about, calling it the biggest economic mistake New Zealand ever made.
Well, because Brian is very much the investment manager, and
True.
I'm not saying I'm saying
it would have been very good for his industry.
It would have been, but I'm not disagreeing with him.
Yeah.
But I'd look at it the way I look at it. People who would be retiring now would be retiring with $1 million plus.
Yeah.
And that would have changed their life. There's so many people out there who rely almost totally on the government pension, which Muldoon increased substantially, but still find it hard to make ends meet. And we're facing the issue of housing. More and more people who retire are not going to have their own house. So if you've got your own house and you've basically got no mortgage, you're all right. But otherwise, you're in trouble.
Yeah. I mean, out of the era and into the 80s, looking at, one of the unusual things about New Zealand, you can look at similar things happening in the UK and the US, and is that it was a Labour Party in New Zealand as a reaction, I guess, to Muldoon being a sort of a big government guy. We sort of ended upside down.
Only in part. Well, I mean, I think you need to think about the people that we had. We had quite a lot of new brand of politicians. We had the Kegels, the Prebles, Nielsen, Butcher. All of these were people who had some sort of economic background. They weren't accountants, but they were, economically literate. And we had debated these issues, so we had a fair idea of where we wanted to go. And the one thing that Muldoon did, and the Labour Party had done it before her, was handout privilege. And what I look at those 4 years when I was finance minister, and the one thing that stands out more than anything else is I dismantled privilege. And everyone, they don't like it, especially the interest groups hate it, but that's what it was.
Did the idea that it was Rogernomics, where did that spring from? I mean, obviously you had a group of people.
One of you guys.
So it was a media construct.
The media.
I mean, I know we had Reaganomics and we had...
It was in that sort of time.
Would you look at, the classic economic sort of debates? You got your monetarists and your neoliberals and your Keynesians. Did you feel like you were picking a side, or was it more organic than that?
I think it's more organic. We were faced with a problem. We needed to fix it. Had I been tribal in the sense Labor right or wrong, I don't think we would have necessarily done it. But you have to remember that a lot of the old style, traditional Labor people like my father, like a lot of those who wanted to help because they'd moved on. And so you had the Kagels and you had the Peter Nielsens and David Butchers and people like that, Trevor DeCleen.
I mean, it did come to a head in the end, I guess, famously with Longy and... Well,
it did. And the impact of that is being seen right now, because that was a big debate. It was about welfare. It was whether we continued with the government running all the welfare institutions, if you had the government deciding when you got an operation or whether you had an operation, if the government was deciding where your kids go to school or whether we change that. And David was adamant that he was not going to move. And he said to me one day, even if it's more efficient, I'm not going to do it. And
so it was an ideological belief that
the government had to do it. And he felt, and he said, which I thought was rubbish, but he said, look, if National come in, they're not going to do this, what you're saying, for the people of Mangere. And I was saying to David, if it works, they won't be able to do anything about it, And so I've always had the view that choice and competition is the direction in which the welfare state has to go. And I think if you look at the report of Treasury, which is saying that in 40 years' time, if things are left as they are, we're going to have a fiscal deficit of 13.3% of GDP, says, well, the present past is impossible. And I think we've got to move forward. And the answer in many ways is the same as it was in the 80s. We've got to get rid of privilege, because until we get rid of privilege, only by removing privilege will you have the room to move. Because what we're going to do, we're going to have to get people in a position where they can save for themselves. So given that our deficit's going to get worse, you've got to make some room in order for lower income people to be able to save for their own retirement, for them to be able to save in order that they have decent health care, etc. And it can be done. It's very easy, actually. And I think it will be enormously popular. But there isn't one political party any longer that supports that. I mean, that's why I founded ACT with Derek Quigley. But ACT more recently, they moved away from the savings element way back in around 2000. But just more recently, they've tended to move away from some of the other basic points relating to choice, etc.
They've sort of filled a gap at the Conservative end where National isn't.
Oh, absolutely, and they're doing it in a brilliant way. but it ain't going to solve the country's problems.
I mean, if you look at what you guys were... and where it came to the head with Longy, there was this idea of a flat tax that even ACT wouldn't put forward a completely flat tax idea.
Oh, well,
less progressive
possibly.
Or less...
Yeah, well, it was, I guess it was that, but it was much more about the welfare state. Well, I mean, if you look at my book that I wrote just a couple of months before the 87 election, Ends and Means, that was very much about saying that our institutions weren't working and that we had to make them more efficient, or otherwise they were going to crumble and people were not going to get the health care they needed, they weren't going to get the education. Well, I'm not saying my answers were this. I believe my answers were right, but put that aside, sure as hell, the health system isn't working, education system's not working. When you've got 40% of kids not turning up, we're going to make that man, we made him Prime Minister. He sure as hell in the 5 years he was Minister of Education didn't do anything about education.
Yeah. What do you say to the, people look at, I think there's actually fairly universal acceptance of what you did through the 80s to the point you got to, because New Zealand really needed to change. Obviously, National took it further, and now, there's always swings and roundabouts in politics, and people have gone, well, a lot of people weren't able to keep up with the change. People, to remove to make that change to sort of self-reliance sort of requires going through a painful period where some people...
Well, yeah, look, you've got to think about what's involved. First, you've got to get rid of the privilege. You're going to have to get rid of privilege somewhere between $12 billion and $20 billion. Most of that privilege is going to come from the affluent. It's going to come from the interest group, the forestry, who get, the money for them grows on trees, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. So the average person wouldn't notice that. Now, having done that, you have to get rid of the pay as you go. Well, you can't get rid of that overnight because that's got to stay. You can't say to, my mother, if she was alive and she's 95, you've got to go back to work, Mum. It's a bit tough. But what you do need to do is to start to get people to save for their own retirement. And you need to use the money you've saved over here to enable them to do it. And if you actually look at the numbers, it's relatively easy to do. Healthcare and pensions cost the government 40-odd million, 42. Personal tax brings in 42 million. So if I get rid of personal tax and give it to people, we can basically do it. Now, it's not quite as simple as
sure.
that.
Well, what about if I take it back to sort of a
and they'd be much happier,
Yeah, at the personal level then, because, people come from... I speak to a lot of people who've done very well from quite humble backgrounds, poor backgrounds, and turned it round. But some people make it out and some people don't. What is it you think can make the difference to getting, people get trapped in poverty. Some people find their way out. They make their way out. Is there something...
Well, it's the way they feel about themselves. If you went along with the sort of system that Derek and I wanted to introduce through Act in 96, or what I'm proposing now, and which I proposed with Professor McCulloch, everyone would be getting $6,000 plus any wage inflation saving every year. So if you're 18, you'd be retiring in 45, 48 years with $3 million. That would buy you a pretty good pension. And then if you kept your Kiwi saver, it's possible that most people would have 5. So you're going to have to ask the affluent to bear part of the cost initially, but they're the ones who would ultimately get the big reward because they're the only people who pay tax. And my calculations are that you'd have a flat tax of 12.5% within 35 years.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions I ask, and you kind of gone a long way to answering it, is really that if you were back in power today, what's the policy you'd most want to bring in to
Well, they're the policies that I wanted to bring in in 1987.
Yeah.
If you want to see those policies, have a look at the last chapter, Ends and Means. But I think I've developed those ideas a lot since then. But essentially, it's still the same idea that you give back to people the money they currently pay in tax and let them spend it on their own behalf. Let them buy their own health care and a catastrophic insurance policy, but pay for their day-to-day health. Let them purchase their children's own education. Now, that's the one area where you would have to give a supplement to most people. But most people, even lower income people, pay sufficient tax to be able to provide for their own pension with an employer subsidy and buy their own health care and buy their risk insurance. And they'll do a damn sight better job than the government. I mean, the government. I mean, I can't understand this. Why do people believe that the government can somehow do a better job than they can? Do they believe that the government and the civil servants care for them more than they care for themselves? Of course they don't.
I guess, I mean, look, just to throw one of the, and whether this covers the whole thing, but what about the people who, your alcoholics, the people who've grown up in those families where they
you'd have, that's a health issue, and you'd have, in my proposal, I mean, for 80-odd% who are healthy, they just have their catastrophic cover, and for those who are chronically ill, well, you put them into a special category, and it's the individual plus their GP who become important rather than some body in Wellington.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, you must. Well, you've walked through Auckland today. That it's not looking great for those people right now under the current system. I guess you could argue.
Well, if you've got 85% of people who are able to look after themselves, who get taxed so that they've got the one thing you worry about is that you're the one whose house falls down on top of you and you become crippled or something of that nature, the catastrophic. But if you put that aside, and then there are the people who are disabled, chronically ill, who need constant care or care on a regular basis. Now, you don't need some great big establishment. You need the GP and the individual, and you need a plan, and you need an organisation that cares for them and is not worried about the rest of us.
Yeah. I mean, thinking about that and what it would take to, it almost seems amazing what you got through in the 80s when you look at the amount of change. When you look at the political landscape now, it seems to have landed in a sort of a very centrist. It's almost like we're back in the 1960s, does it?
Well, it is. We are in some ways.
Yeah, I mean,
back in the 1960s, where it's all slow. But you just take health, for instance. Ask yourself a question: why is it that people believe that having, the cost of health plus a great big monstrosity department looking after them is cheaper than just having the money with the individual and a GP? So you have a GP, the money,
yep.
and they somehow they think you create some enormous institution that'll be cheaper. Give me a break.
Do you think? I mean, there's been some, some things like the global financial crisis. People talk about having undermined the view that that we can let the market sort it out and that sort of thing. Did you notice a change around that, or even the pandemic, sort of the swing back to big government type approach?
Well, I'm not sure. I think the problem is that there's nowhere out there much who's battling for any other point of view. I mean, if you think about politics at the moment, you've got 4 parties that are basically saying the same thing.
With slightly different numbers on where they might set the tax.
Well, if I describe the parties, the Greens are basically split in 2. One half of them has got a communist agenda. The other half is a hard left-wing regulators, and their policies are based on fear. The Labor Party is old style. They have gone back pretty much to some of the 1960 type policies. Policies when I first went in 69, 72 was still in the caucus. National, and I think most people, if I go back to Labor Party, they sort of sum the Labor Party up by saying they've lost their way. And they look at the National Party and they don't think they're any better. They basically say, well, these guys have been in power 60-odd% of the time in the last 60 years, and what have they done? And what do they stand for now? And so it's not. And then they look at ACT and they say they're a right-wing, hard-nosed right-wing party, which was never the intention. I still don't believe is what they are, but that's what people believe. And unfortunately, just recently, there's been a couple of policy announcements which reinforce that.
This sort of the culture wars and that sort of thing doesn't help, does it? Because you're trying to talk about an economic revolution, and people are, like the conservatism that people are sort of would ascribe to ACT, when actually they, I guess what I'm saying is it's the economic debate, and this is where I try and push things along, keeps getting lost in a bunch of distractions.
Well, I think that's probably right. I mean, at the moment, when you look out, as Treasury did, we're going nowhere. And it was what's happening to us was highly predictable, really. The fact that as the number of people retired was going to grow much faster than the number of people in the workforce. And we're going to have to change in order to solve that. And my own view is that it all comes down to giving people choice and giving them the money in their own house to make those decisions.
Do you think we'll end up, at the end of that Muldoon era, the country nearly went bankrupt, and it sort of opened the path for some quite radical change? Is it sort of human nature that we don't confront these things until it requires, dramatic action?
Well, I don't know. I think it's the nature of the politicians, and we don't elect the right people. I think the 80 Longy cabinet was a real mixture of people who decided that they were going to do the right thing, and if they lost, so be it. But they were going to do what they thought was right. But I don't think we have that anymore. I mean, if I look at the last 20 years, you tell me anyone, or the last 25, any government that's done anything.
Yeah. And they're very, very reactive to polls and to...
Well, exactly. John Key lived by the polls, and it's very dangerous. If you want to help people, you have to tell them the truth. The problem is that the politicians of today, they want to help themselves, so they poll in order to know what to say. And it's disgusting.
Feedback loop. Look, I've got to wrap it up there, Roger.
That's right.
Thanks for talking. I just finally, so what's keeping you busy? You're still doing some writing?
I'm still doing some writing, and I don't get to watch as much cricket as I used to, but I still watch a bit of that. But generally, I'm in the process of trying to. I'm not sure whether it's going to be a paper or another book, but right now I'm looking at the election and what's going to happen. The issue really, to me, in some way, are the four parties going to stay where they are? Is National going to get some guts and do something? Will ACT get moved back to where they used to be a bit? What's going to happen with New Zealand First? There's a huge opportunity for them or one of the other parties, but I don't know that they're good enough to take it.
Well, look, thank you very much for coming in. It's been great to chat. Cheers. And thank you for listening. If you've got feedback, drop me a line, liam.dan@nzme.co.nz. Thanks to my producer, Ethan Sills, and our editor, Leanne McDonald. Follow Money Talks on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. Catch you again next week.